are the things you should not say when fighting critical race theory? I would argue there are. I would argue you should avoid politicizing this fight. I think I'm in pretty good company, but I'm going to first explain to you what I mean by politicizing it, using a lawsuit recently filed in Ohio against the Ohio State Board of Education, which has been sued for allegedly banning criticism of the 1619 Project. Now, there's text from this lawsuit. I'll put the link to this Daily Wire article in the description box, but I want to sort of fast forward to the text specifically of the lawsuit. It's not the full text. This is just some of it and some of the things it alleges. I'm not going to talk about whether they have a good case or a bad case about the shutting down of public comment. I'm not going to go there. I'm not an attorney. I can't comment on whether the case is good from a legal standpoint. I simply want to talk about this language and what my concerns are as far as including it in this lawsuit. If the lawsuit is about the Board of Education shutting down criticism because it criticizes something very specific and because it is criticism, I think, that's the point that should be made. If that is against the law in general or in Ohio, I think that's the point that should be made. If the argument is that critical race theory that the board is advancing is itself a violation of rights, that's the argument that should be made. Instead, what I've seen in this language is reference to a political ideology, and I think that's going to get this case mired in the weeds of rhetoric and semantic arguments. Let me explain. First, we'll read it. On July 14th, 2020, the Ohio State Board of Education embraced and adopted policies advancing Marxist ideologies of critical race theory and the false proposition of systemic racism. It adopted a resolution giving the title of Resolution to Condemn Racism and the Advance Equity and Opportunity for Black Students, Indigenous Students, and Students of Color, declaring that it shall require training for all state employees and contractors working with the Department of Education to identify their own implicit biases, and directed the Ohio Department of Education to re-examine the academic content standards and model curriculums to make recommendations to the State Board of Education as necessary to eliminate bias and ensure that racism and the struggle for equality are accurately addressed. In further support of advancing the Marxist ideologies of critical race theory and the false proposition of systemic racism, the Ohio Department of Education has posted on its website support for the 1619 Project, a Marxist-inspired effort at revisionist history that falsely seeks to redefine and vilify the United States and its founding principles. As a result of the board embracing and adopting Marxist ideologies that undermine the freedom-loving aspects of American society, a significant outcry and shock arose from freedom-loving individuals throughout the state of Ohio. Now, how many times did you see the word Marxist in there? I count 1, 2, 3, 4 at least in just this small segment. I haven't read the entire brief, so, the entire lawsuit. So I don't know how many times it appears. Here's my question for you, my audience. What does the specific ideology of the training or behind the training have to do with whether it is legal to limit public comment about it, whether it as a form of curriculum is legal, whether it in practice violates the rights of students and or staff? And if this lawsuit is specifically about the shutting down of public comment, what difference does it make what the political ideology is behind the curriculum? Should it make a difference? And then the final question is it even true? Is it even accurate that critical race theory is Marxist ideology? And the reason I raise that is that has been debated, is still being debated. And whether or not I agree with the critics who say, oh, no, it's not Marxist. So they're splitting hairs, in my opinion, because they're saying Marx didn't comment on this, or some Marxists, in fact, are saying that this version of sort of neo-Marxism is actually doing damage. And I'm going to show you examples. I don't know that this has any place in the discussion at all. I think you're going to get people going down a rabbit hole of this isn't Marxist when the issue ought to be due process. Shall require training for all state employees and contractors to identify their own implicit bias. You're guilty, prove you're innocent. You have to go to this training because you're de facto guilty of something that, by the way, isn't illegal in America. It's not illegal to have implicit bias. So to require training paid for with tax dollars and a very specific kind of training that alleges that you are something that one could argue is a defamation of character or slander or libel, depending if it's spoken or in writing, that in of itself strikes me as a deprivation of due process, a violation of rights in that regard, to force you as a state employee to undergo a specific kind of training that could be interpreted as punitive or segregationist. Who's going to be trained? Who has implicit bias? Is it going to be everyone or just the white people? That right there could be a case all by itself. Then as far as changing the standards of the curriculum, in what way? In practice, is it going to involve segregation of the students, of the staff, or of the material? Is it going to use stereotyping? Is it going to, discuss people based on race in different ways, assigning blame to them when they're small children? How does this align with the state standards in any way, shape, or form? These would all be excellent things to bring up as far as why they want to have public comment on this issue. How it translates into action in the classroom, actions that violate student civil liberties. That might get the court's attention as far as, I'm not so sure we ought to be shutting down public comment about things that could potentially violate the civil liberties of students and staff. But if you spend so much time on how it's Marxist, now it sounds like you're making an ideological or political appeal. And there are those who will take advantage of that. In fact, the person advancing this argued people don't really understand it. That's what the board member's saying. People are commenting on something they don't really understand. When you throw in Marxism, her argument has more weight than it otherwise would. It should sound just condescending and rude to say you don't understand what you're talking about. But when you throw that in, it raises the point. Why? Why do I say that? Because back in October, CNN held forth with what critical race theory is and isn't. And I love that they have this ad thing right on top. And if you scroll down, they're going after, so-called right-wing media and so forth and so on. But they talk about what it is, and they throw in just enough truth. Well, it's because it assumes that America's racist, and then they give you examples that may or may not be examples of racism, but they assert that they are. Then they get to who came up with the idea. Okay. And they talk about truthfully who came up with the ideas. How has it evolved? Where is it taught? And what's interesting is when they get down to why there's so much resistance to it, they get into how there's politics behind it, how Trump did this, how they get very political about it. So when you start throwing, you mentioned Marx, and you're going to, it's like throwing red meat to the people defending it and saying, Marx never even wrote about this. Let's cut over to this, Sage Journals, Power and Education. Okay. This is 2019. And this says, since entering the field of education studies, critical race theory has had an uneasy relationship with Marxism. One particular point of disagreement between Marxist and critical race theory scholars centers on the critical race theory concept of white supremacy. Some Marxist scholars suggest that because of its reliance on white supremacy, critical race theory is unable to explain the prevalence of racism in Western capitalist societies. These Marxists also argue that white supremacy, as understood within CRT, is actively damaging to radical emancipatory movements because the concept misrepresents the position of the white working class as the beneficiaries of racism. Because remember, Marxism supports the working class, period, irrespective of race. So you run the risk that you're going to have people who actually, because Marxism isn't illegal in America. I hate to say it. We shouldn't be teaching it as fact or as the approved way of thinking in America's public schools. But if we say that, then we certainly can't teach that capitalism is a good thing either. So you have to be really careful when you start adding ideology to the mix, because you run the risk that you're banned from talking positively about capitalism. You will find that the Heritage Foundation says that critical race theory is Marxist. That has been said, and it's also been criticized because, again, Marxists will argue Marx never said this. James Lindsay has said repeatedly it's at most Marxian in that it's influenced by the teachings of Marx, in that Marx saw the world as divided into power struggles between oppressors and oppressed. But what critical race theory does is replace class. We replace the proletariat and the bourgeoisie with black and white. So that's the difference. And Marx never mentioned race in this regard, just as I've just read to you. So you're going to have critics on the Marxist side saying, this isn't Marxist. This isn't Marxism. And I can see a judge or whoever's going to hear this case just getting like, this sounds very political. It sounds like your gripe is political. The school board is not there to hear your politics. They've had enough public comment. They heard you. Goodbye. I mean, who knows? Who knows what they could say? That's not the issue anyway. What the politics of it are really isn't the issue, as much as it's an issue for you and I, perhaps, and we don't want our kids being taught these things. We think they're anti-American and anti-liberty, which they are. The argument has to be a principled argument, right? I'm going to link to this piece in New Discourses because this is what you need to understand when you are taking a stance against it. A principled statement of opposition to critical race theory, an excerpt from Cynical Theories. Last year, Helen Pluckrose and I dedicated most of our time to writing a book about how activist scholarship has risen to prominence and created societal conditions that threaten to rip our societies apart. Our goal was to document and explain these academic developments as fairly as possible, while still making clear how they have equipped a certain kind of social critique, commentary, and activists with the philosophy of postmodernism. Now, this is very important. You don't need to know much about postmodernism to understand why this is a big problem. In fact, you only need to know two key ideas. Postmodern philosophy is radically skeptical that objective truth exists and can even approximately be known, and it forwards the competing view that knowledge is just an assertion of politics by other means. That is, the key of postmodernism as a social philosophy is that whether a claim is true or not doesn't matter and misses the point. All that matters is how that claim can be used politically. So the irony is, if you go in with a political argument about why they shouldn't censor you, that it's Marxist, you're politicizing something that is, they're trying to make everything political. They will use the correct argument against you. This is how they operate in the first place. This is exactly what they will do. They use the freedoms against you. So when you do that, it's like you play right into their hands. They're saying, see, it's all political. Everything's political. The development of this divorce from the truth, political turn to everything, and ruthless approach to social critique present in critical theories is how we arrive at this literally riotous, almost incomprehensible moment in history, so it matters. And there's an answer: being principled, taking a principled stand for truth, depoliticizing, and encouraging fairness and honesty in place of ruthless social critique can diffuse this moment and defeat the problem that has created. Okay? So when you take a principled stance, this is what it sounds like. We affirm that racism remains a problem in society. What did the lawsuit say? That it's this false statement of systemic racism. People debate that. I think it's false as they describe it. But ironically, I think it's true as they are implementing CRT. They are creating systemic racism. So I'm hesitant to say there's no systemic racism because there literally is in the public schools right now and in government agencies and so forth where they're pushing CRT. That is literally systemic racism. So it's a lot more principled to say racism remains a problem because it does. The woke are racist. We deny that critical race theory and intersectionality provide the most useful tools to do so. So now you're making a principled argument that this doesn't work. The school board wants to advance something that is not going to achieve the goal of improving student outcomes. Okay? They want rigorous analysis. Not allowing public comment is not rigorous analysis. We contend that racism is defined as prejudiced attitudes and discriminatory behavior against individuals or groups on the grounds of race and can be successfully addressed as such. So they want to use segregation. They want to label whites as oppressors, blacks as victims. That is literally prejudiced attitudes and discriminatory behavior. So any lawsuit against critical race theory should hone in on the behaviors, on the specific curricula, on how the 1619 Project paints white people in a negative light is not true and based on facts. It is in this we can't know the truth nonsense, okay? So school is supposed to be teaching our children critical thinking in terms of how to find what? The truth. Teaching our kids there is no such thing as truth, or that the truth is whatever my feels tell me it is not what public education is supposed to be about. That's a better and more principled argument. We deny that racism is hard baked into society via discourses, that it is unavoidable and present in every interaction. I can almost guarantee you the school board is making the argument that it is. CNN is making the argument that it is. That's what you deny We deny that the best way to deal with racism is by restoring social significance to racial categories and racially heightening their salience. When you violate student civil rights, when you toss aside the Civil Rights Act, where we treat all the students, all the staff, et cetera, equally, irrespective of race, gender, all of these identity markers, you've lost the moral high ground. So, you have to argue from the moral high ground. You have to say, racism exists. Then you can say they're the racists. You have to say we need rigorous discourse. Then you can say they're shutting it down, and so forth. So the purpose of this video is to help you understand that focusing in on the ideological underpinnings of critical race theory is a losing argument. You might be correct in a very technical sense that this is Marxian. You might be correct that it's teaching anti-capitalism. None of those things are illegal. The rest of what I just talked about is. So if you're going to press a lawsuit or you're going to argue with your school, you need to stick to the principled argument. I'll put the link in the description box. Please do read this article. Please share this with your friends. We want to defeat this toxic theory. We don't want our children brainwashed in this way. It's a terribly divisive, toxic, ruinous way of seeing the worldview, and it is the antithesis of an education. Thank you for watching. I hope that you found this useful. Subscribe, like, comment, and share. Thanks so much.